Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. 2, because I'm a fan of punk music. And 3, it's just more fun, right? If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. Please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have a returning guest, actually, and I was looking at my records just before starting this conversation, and I think this must be the third time that my guest has been on the show. So my guest this week is Joseph Michelli. So Joseph, welcome back. I must say that Joseph is a chief experience officer at the Michelli Experience, a speaker, best-selling author, like a multiple time author, and also an organizational consultant. But Joseph, welcome back to the podcast. And how are you, sir?
Well, first off, I promise I'll get it right this time, so I don't have to keep coming back over and over again. I am quite good, thank you. It's so good to be with you. I think I enjoy being with you so much that I just make up excuses to be on this.
Well, you write another book, and then I have to interview you about it.
Yeah, I wish I could get on your show without having to go through all that work, but I do write a book.
Maybe we just need to organize an impromptu rummage around one of these days.
We can just do coffee without having to be on the podcast. That will work. Okay, yeah. Good.
So, Joseph, I know that people kind of tune in and out of podcasts, and sometimes I've got some long-time listeners and readers, but for people that are not familiar with your work and with yourself, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also about the work that you do?
I think I'm Adrian Swinsko over in the US of sorts. I mean, I think we share a very common love for trying to improve customer service and customer experience. I think we try to do that through our keynotes and workshops and our advisory functions. So I think we're very similar in what we attempt to do, though I like the way you do it very much.
Thank you, sir. So now that, as I say, you've written a number of books. The last time I think we spoke, we were talking about a book that you did, which was, I would suggest, an exhaustive case study on the success of Airbnb and how they can do that. And you've done it for a number of different brands, including people like Mercedes-Benz in the US and things. But this new book that you've got come out is called Stronger Through Adversity, which is like hot off the presses because you've actually written it in the last few kind of months. But rather than me telling people about it, can you tell me about it and how it came about and kind of what's the main idea behind the book?
So Adrian, I was working on a book for Godiva. They're a client of mine, the chocolate company. And I was in late February, I was supposed to go to their plant in Pennsylvania. And out of an abundance of caution, they canceled the trip. And they also said, we need to put a pause on the book.
Right.
And I thought, wow, what is happening here? And then I was on a bunch of task forces for my clients, and I was seeing leaders trying to figure out how to respond to a sub-microscopic organism, 1/1000th the width of a human hair, and just almost devolving into tears behind the complexities of it. And so I saw some leaders really doing pretty well, and then I saw some using old techniques that just weren't getting them there. And so all of that led me to just talking to them, like, how are you trying to approach this challenge like none other than we've seen in our lifetimes? And I got such an interesting set of insights about what they were affirming in leadership and what they were learning anew that I began writing the book. And McGraw-Hill was kind to let me get going on it. And before you know it, friends of friends of friends of clients, and we had 140 leaders globally that had participated, and thus the book Stronger Through Adversity.
Perfect. And it's like, and I guess this must be probably one of the fastest books that a major publisher may have actually produced, because
Oh,
you and I kind of know how long sometimes these kind of processes take. But I mean, this has been done within what, 6 months, five
yeah,
months?
it was obscene on every level. I mean, if you think about it, we interviewed 140 people. We meaning me. I interviewed them all, and then after the interviews, then you transcribe it just like we would do, say, a podcast to a transcribed blog, and then just to put it together, and then to have the support of the folks as I wrote it, and literally wrote 20 hours a day for a
Wow.
good 5 or 6 months, maybe 4 months. And then they're turning it around at record speed at the publishers. So it's been a blessing. A lot of people aligned to try to get a message out on pandemic tested leadership.
Mm. Now, so you were kind enough rather to share a copy of the book with me, and I was been able to kind of go through it. And, I mean, I've not been able to kind of read it kind of cover to cover, but
What
I've definitely.
don't you only get 4 hours of sleep? What's what? Yeah, no,
Dude,
no,
I'm
I
trying. I'm trying
totally
to
understand.
manage on
I'm so
50.
grateful.
I'm trying to manage on 15 minutes, man.
I'm so grateful that you take the time, and you'd be amazed and you're an experienced creator, so you know the importance of listening
Mm.
and getting intel on things. But so often you do interviews these days and people don't even know what the book's about. They're just trying to generate content without any thoughtfulness. So I'm very grateful for this.
Well, thank you. It's very kind of you. I mean, but I have had a chance to really dig into sort of different bits of the book, and so I get a sense of some of the stuff that's coming out of it. And in the book, you say that you've been able to, out of all these 140 different interviews, to be able to highlight 20 lessons on how to prevail through challenges and setbacks, that and think that these are the things you learn. I mean, because it seems to me, out of all of this, what I've kind of thought about, I mean, it's like we've seen this extraordinary thing happen to pretty much everybody around the world. And I think one of the big lessons that I've learned is, one is that we've been able to respond to it, or react to it rather, I guess. But also, I think we'll learn some lessons around what we need to do next time around, because that's the only thing we know that for certain, really, I guess, is that there will be another crisis, however it may kind of like form, or wherever it may kind of come from. But hopefully, we'll be better prepared to deal with it next time around, particularly from a leadership perspective. Um,
Absolutely. That's the hope, right? I mean, that was the fundamental belief. It's a little off the beaten path for me. I mean, I like you mostly write books about customer experience, and this book takes me a little off path, and typically my books are around one single brand, right?
yeah.
And this is 140 different leaders from brands as varied as Verizon, a telecommunications provider here in the U.S., to
Mhm.
Godiva, to Starbucks, to Mercedes-Benz, a lot of the brands I've written about, but plenty others, Microsoft and Google and the like.
As well as kind of like sort of people, organizations from the public sector. I mean, whether that's law enforcement or healthcare, or kind of government, local government, and things. So it's a really broad spectrum, and I really sort of enjoyed the fact that it had such a broad spectrum.
That's kind of, I mean, we tried to stay away from truly elected official types,
Yes.
because we felt like that's a skewed version of leadership. There's so much self-serving in trying to get elected that
Yes.
we wanted to take that a little out of the equation. But public safety individuals, we were very much interested in trying to understand how they approached fire, police, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to do to give people a flavor of the book, I wanted to actually just kind of dig into a few areas, because ultimately you want people to kind of to buy the book and to read it and to learn from it. So if I may, I would like to start with this idea that early on in the book, you write that in the early days of the pandemic, many of the leaders with whom I spoke to, or you spoke to, reported that they had lost perspective on self-care. They were running on adrenaline, caffeine, and a shortage of sleep. Now, I mean, that really kind of resonated with me, not because I'd experienced kind of that necessarily, but I'd heard echoes of that from many other people I'd talked to. So can you tell us about what you found out about how leaders have now learned to take care of themselves. And because I also think that it may also point to an area that's worth paying attention to, i.e., this idea of the leader's experience as separate from the broader employee experience, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'll give you two different presidents. One was president of Marriott, Stephanie Linyart, and one was the president of Microsoft, Matt Renner, and they were in very different places. Matt was, overseeing Teams, this
Mhm.
incredible blow up platform we all needed to be able to collaborate with one another. So he was not able to sleep because the demand on being able to provide these solutions for enterprises was huge.
Right.
On the other side, Stephanie was looking straight down the barrel of lots of layoffs and furloughs and travel industry coming to a screeching halt. And so she was not able to sleep in large measure with the weight of the decision making
Mm.
that was upon her and the human consequences that lay waste out there. And so it was for lots of different reasons, but I think leaders often get lost in the notion that you don't have to be selfless to be a leader.
Yeah.
You can't be selfish. We got that. But this notion of taking care of yourself isn't selfish. And I think that the way we title the principle, or I titled the principle of the book, is put your mask on first, which is really kind of a controversial thing here in the United States, the mere mention of a mask. But I wasn't meaning that kind
Let's
of
not go
mask.
there. Let's not go
Yeah,
there.
that wasn't where I was going. I was just saying, the flight attendant messaging around
Yeah.
put your mask on first so you can take care of others. That logic really comes to play with leaders. You have to lead yourself first. You have to demonstrate self-care, and in doing so you enable your team members to realize the importance of self-care as well. If you run yourself into the ground tacitly, you're giving the expectation to your team that they need to do the same.
Yeah.
People were just, literally one of my favorite realizations is that people were afraid that they would be considered non-essential, right? So they
Yes.
overworked to prove the essentialness of what they did, as leaders and as frontline workers as well.
Which is fascinating because that's almost a bit like a manifestation of presenteeism, like when you have a physical environment and it's people end up getting stuck to their desks, or they're doing kind of physically long hours and obviously kind of manifestly kind of like long hours, and showing that they're doing, because that's almost like a way of proving your worth in many ways.
Yeah, it's just being able to jump on Zoom call as the alternative to being physically present. But
Yeah.
it was a lot about that.
Yeah, because the thing that the last part of my question was about the leader's experience, because I wrote this thing back in July where I was sort of reflecting on what I saw as being, all the different changes that are going on, whether it's consumer behavior or just general business kind of behavior, and whether those were enforced changes or they were changes that people had actually kind of decided to make themselves. And the thing that occurred to me, there's all these different imperatives, one of which obviously was the experience kind of one, and how that's changed, where the customer and employee experience has changed. And then the thing that spun out of that as well is that we were seeing this, I was suggesting they were seeing this emergence of like a stakeholder experiences with having increasing importance, and how that's tied to purpose and all that sort of stuff. But then there was this other thing, which was the leader experience. And because we asked lots of people who are in leadership positions, whether that's frontline leaders or all the way up to executive leaders, to look after their people. Yeah. And that was kind of their thing. And it struck me, I was thinking, what we've had such a paradigm shift in terms of the environment that we are asking our leaders to operate in, that if we're asking them to look after our people, then my question was, well, who's looking after the people that are looking after our people?
And
And
if people haven't read that piece that you did, they should, because it was brilliant. And I think it's, again, that slightly left of, you're not right on the bubble thinking around things, and forcing us to look at it differently. The leader experience, and this is an ecosystem, right? The
yeah,
whole thing is a flippin' giant ecosystem. And sometimes we focus on one part of it, the customer, at the exclusion of the employee.
mm-hmm.
And then we forget that there's a leader that has to inspire, and who's taking care of them,
Yeah,
and stakeholder who's investing in large companies. So it is definitely important. And I think what we saw in my journey was that these leaders had to put the pause button on, because this was not a sprint; it was a marathon.
Yeah, and absolutely,
Blow out
absolutely.
their energy, they couldn't move the ecosystem forward.
Yeah. And so what did you actually learn when, because another thing about kind of like looking after people, but then there's also this thing around, there's this overarching sort of thing around other customers, the center of our decision making, it's really important and everything else. And what did you learn from leaders that you spoke to regarding like how their priorities can change through this time? I mean, did they prioritize employees over customers, or was it the other way around, or how did they strike that balance? Because
So
that's
you've got
critical, I think.
you've got on your side of the world Richard Branson, who's always said that the employee is more important than the customer. On my side
Mm,
of the we've got Jeff Bezos, who's always said that the customer is more important than the employee,
yeah.
and they both have done pretty well. And you don't want to get in the middle of the debate. What I saw was people like John Gaynor, who's somebody I've consulted for a long time when he was the head of International Dairy Queen. And
Yeah.
in those days, he was always the politician around that issue. He would always say, "We need them both; they're equal. You can't choose one of your children over another." But during the pandemic, when he was on several boards, Jack in the Box and a variety of other restaurant
Hmm.
chains, he said he changed it all around. It had to be the employees. And so I actually, in the book, champion a principle called practice employee obsession, which
Hmm.
in general, the word obsession is a little loaded. It's kind of like the word punk. I don't know. But
Well, yeah, the different
that,
uses of the word and different kind of like depending on
right.
kind
I
of
mean,
like who wears it, right?
yeah, people can take it on the negative connotation of it, but it is this focused awareness of, and I think that you saw much more focus on your teams, because in the end, if you could not figure out how to get them safe and keep them safe, there was no keeping customers through this thing, and you needed ingenuity like you've never needed it before from the front lines
Yeah,
to make it work. So I saw a high priority of employees first in ways I hadn't seen before.
right. And then because I was also thinking other thing that struck me as well out of the book was that this idea that leaders have had to learn, I mean, very quickly, um, to listen more. Um, but I guess my question about that was, what did you learn from the leaders about listening more, and how have they been able to do that, particularly how, given the environment that we're currently in and that everything is a Zoom or a Teams or a Google Hangout kind of call, and that just takes an inordinate amount of time and effort and energy. So kind of what's the insight you've gained around that and sort of managing your time and being able to listen and learn and so on and so forth?
Well, I think it's a great question. I mean, Steve Cannon, who used to be the head of Mercedes-Benz USA, would have every meeting that he was holding, he would have people bring in an item for 1 minute to share something personal about themselves from their home. So it could be
Right.
their dog, it could be it could be their kids. It wasn't that he was asking them to spend 20 minutes off topic, right? He wanted just to have a little bit of themselves brought to work.
Right.
And I think it wasn't about how much time, it was asking about people in a different kind of way and
Mm,
listening for emotion, because there were a lot of high emotions going on that you needed to kind of gauge.
mm,
Besides the formal listening like that, a lot of it was pulse surveying.
mm,
And I think the pulse survey came up much more than it had before. Again, both employees and in customers, just
mm.
wanting to see how you're thinking about PPE, wanting to see how you're thinking
Yeah.
about the safety of returning to the office or whatever it
Mm.
might be.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that's the thing is that um, one of the kind of things I've been kind of thinking about is the idea around sort of creating space as leaders, because I've heard horror stories, and you've been telling me about it, that people, working incredibly long hours because they're on back-to-back calls trying to kind of move these initiatives or projects or forward, or trying to make big changes or kind of work with global clients and things. And I guess I was kind of thinking about, it's not just about listening, it's also about time and kind of managing your time. And that comes back to the sort of the self-care element of it. And it's just like, I mean, I guess it just gets really complicated when you're a leader. So I mean, what did you learn about kind of was there something that came out of it around about being very, if you like, critical about how you devote your time and how you create space to think and reflect and things?
Yeah. So Stacy Salvi, who's with Fitbit, and Fitbit, is a personal wearable
Yeah.
device, and she said, "Look, we finally at Fitbit had to say stop, get up, and walk. Right, like this. You've got a personal device on you that
Right.
tell you to do that." And at that company, they had to do it, and they had to restructure so they weren't doing back-to-back Zoom calls. That you had to give yourself some break. You had to also look at, is there a purpose for this Zoom meeting?
Right.
We had leaders who literally said they were dreaming of in Zoom. They had dreams of Zoom calls, right? And so at some point you have to wonder, is this all purposeful? I mean, yes, there's people are hungry for information. There's a craving for, but do I have a reason to do this call? And
Yes.
you found that you can over communicate. Now, frankly, most of the time we under communicate, but you can just talk for the sake of talking. And if you do that, you are taking up time that you could be using for restoration and recreating both yourself and your team to take on the next challenge.
Because I guess what you're not doing is that um, if you're always in meetings, then you're almost on that. You're always doing, and you're not necessarily making the space and time to sort of really think and to make kind of changes, because everything is kind of almost on the fly in many ways. And I think that's really important. And I've heard some really interesting stories about, as you say, kind of people asking kind of very critical questions around, do I need to be involved with this? Or even just in some extremes, people just arbitrarily saying, I'm going to cancel or opt out of 20% of the meetings I'm in this kind of week because I need to create space. And
Absolutely,
just
absolutely. And I think,
just as a way of pushing things forward.
you didn't create Punk CX, as a result of meetings. There was a point, a creative moment where you've thought about a lot of different inputs, and something emerges that gives you this platform, this angle on a problem. And that's, I think, without that white space, it's very difficult for leaders to generate that. And I heard that from a number of leaders, and there was a conscious, intentional moment, particularly after they got over the first wave of the crisis, right?
Yeah.
Then they could kind of stop for a second and say, we've got to analyze what we just went through. We got to give a little buffer. So it was very tactical for those who were successful.
So I know the kind of the book, I don't want to highlight kind of or list out all the 20 different kind of lessons, because the book is is there to kind of capture all of them. But I mean, is there any that really stood out for you or surprised you?
Sure, I'm going to really act like you now. Well, yeah, it's the horse herd leadership mentality. Is
Okay.
that, or do you want more? Okay, no, I'll explain.
I want more. I want
Well,
more.
good. Thank you. That's what I always felt like with what's he talking about with Punk CX? So the want more thing is that wild horse herds have a alpha mare who leads the pack. They have an alpha sire in the back, and they have a variety of horses in the herd themselves that shape the herd behavior. And what I heard from leaders was, I never thought about this in my lifetime, right? But I heard from leaders that functionally they were moving their positioning in relation to their teams based on what the crisis need was, and that they had a familiar place they liked to lead from, but they had to resist that at different times in the journey. And so, sometimes they needed to be out front. They needed to say, we're going to take that hill. Here's the vision. The path is kind of murky, but we're going to find our way through it if you just trust me. And there was times they had to drop back into the herd and say, look, I am no better than you. I'm not asking you to do anything I would not do. I am a part of this team. And then there were other times they had to say, I am out of this. I'm not speaking. I'm staying quiet until the team has spoken. I'm letting you kind of self-lead. I will nudge you. I will celebrate you, but I will not get out in front of you on this innovative task. And so for me, that was pretty mind-boggling. I hadn't really thought about positionality as it relates to team as a leader and situational needs that require you to take a different posture.
Yeah, no, that's it's great, and it's great that kind of awareness is really kind of like it started to almost like force its way to the surface and things. But I mean, it's those that's what one of that really stood out for you. I mean, but do you have any kind of like personal favorites? You know what I mean, like drums that you like to bang on about
Oh
kind
my
of
gosh, there were
leadership?
so many stories, Adrian. It was 140 people, and they're all sharing from their heart this
Yeah.
stuff going on in them. Their losses, their people died on their teams from COVID, and there's so much. But one lady, and I think her lesson was a really good one, is that as a leader, sometimes all you can do is be with people. You can't fix it. You
Yeah.
just got to be with. And she was talking about, she's a leader in nursing care, and literally one of her nurses, she was on the COVID unit, and one of her nurses was shaking as she held the iPad up in the
Mm.
final moments of life for the patient, trying to let the family say their final goodbyes. And this leader was watching her team shaking, her hands shaking, barely able to hold the iPad. And she just remembered the powerlessness of the
Hmm.
situation, that you can't always do something. And then when the lady came out of the room, the nurse came out of the room, our nurse, couldn't hug her, couldn't do anything, but just stood there in silence with her. And it was, I don't know, to me, sometimes I think I'd make it too complicated. Just being with people is a form of service.
I think I really like that. It's a heartbreaking story. Um, but I mean, that really resonates with me, and something that I've learned as well, recently is that because I'm sort of a natural fixer or problem solver or something, and sometimes you can't, and it's not your role to fix or problem solve. You just have to be with kind of like people or be with it, as it were.
And that's a
And
fix. I think it's a fix in
I know it is,
it's
but
not
it's
a
an
constant.
unexpected fix, right? It's like choosing to do nothing is still a choice.
Yeah, it's the quiet fix. It's a calm, silent fix. It's very odd for me too, but I think those are the lessons I needed to hear personally.
Yeah, yeah. So let's kind of like expand this out a little bit, Joseph, because actually, the leadership doesn't exist in isolation, and it's all for a reason to to get sort of stuff done, and but I'd be interested in just to hear your perspective on what you've been seeing sort of change around us and what's kind of like what's emerging out the pandemic and what's really stood out for you.
Well, no one would wish this on anyone, but since we had the pandemic, I think it's been a gift to customer experience in many, many ways.
Yeah.
The gift, I think, is that many brands were, too slow to act. They were so worried about their brand equity. Well, guess what? No one had any ability to lean on their past. They had to move quickly in the now. So
Mm.
these roadmaps on technologies that would make the customer's life better, they were just expedited, and we jumped ahead 5 years on technological solutions for customers. So I think we're just seeing all the benefits of that. We're seeing the digital ordering, we're seeing all on the e-commerce side, that the touchless, the contactless options. Lines are going to be a thing of the past. There's just so much good that has come out on the tech side of the thing. Sharing platforms, use of virtual meetings, all of that. It's just good stuff for customers. And at the same time, I think we learned that all the technology in the world is just a bunch of really cool tools,
Mm.
and they enable us. God knows what we'd have done if we'd have tried to do this without the World Wide Web, right?
Sure.
But we longed for people. We crave humanity.
Yes.
We turn on our cameras. We want to see people's faces. We don't like this idea of social distance. We don't mind physically distancing ourselves for health, but we certainly don't like to be socially distant from people. So, and to me, there was so many things I saw leaders understanding
Mm.
about the CX. Make it technology aided and human powered. That's the final assessment of this thing in retrospect.
Right. I mean, and I mean, I mean, I've seen many of the kind of same things. And so, a lot of the nice to haves have been dropped, and everybody's been focusing on the kind of like the must dos, and being able to push those through at records kind of like speed, and being and in many ways actually seeing a collapsing of the gap between rhetoric and actually activity, which I think has been a big thing that's shown up for me. Is a lot of people talk a good game, but it weren't really kind of putting in the if you like the hard yards, as it were. But now the pandemic is and the crisis has imposed immediate constraints on people, and therefore they've had to get stuff done, and turn talk into action.
Yeah, I think the line is, that we either change from inspiration or desperation, and
Yeah.
probably you and I used to try to inspire people to bring their best customer experience to bear.
Mm.
Now I don't have to do much of
You're like
that.
going, do that, like that they did.
Yeah.
And so, like, going forward, I mean, like, what do you think the because we are kind of where we are now, we've made some massive strides, but like, what do you think the future of service and experience kind of looks like? And given the things have been sort of like, I guess, remapped, recalibrated, call it what you will, what does the future look
I
like?
have a theory. I have a theory that we have to create businesses that are digital only.
Mm,
Everything needs to be done digitally with no. I should not have to opt for a human. I should be able to get everything done digitally. I mean, it's not always possible, but I think you should be striving for that.
yeah.
Gosh, that would save us if anything ever resurfaced. Then the other piece of it is we have to have a very high touch, high quality human experience that tracks that completely, so that the consumer has the option of either going an all digital track or an all human track. But in reality, what they'll do is they'll bounce up and down between digital and human. And so you'll give them all of the choices they want at the key touch points in your customer journey. I can opt human, I can opt tech. It's really up to me. Do I want convenience? Do I want elevated service? I just think that's the future. And
Mm,
brands that get that and deliver those two tracks and allow people to have a hybrid journey across them at all key touch points with the brands are the ones that'll win. And the ones that don't will become dinosaurs. And we'll look back at them and go, gosh, that Polaroid camera, that was really a cool thing.
yeah.
Whatever.
But do you think that also kind of like I think that you do think the spotlight is also going to turn on all of the things that we're seeing emerging in the customer, the consumer sort of space, that spotlight is eventually going to like turn on the employee space, and the
Oh,
same sort of almost challenges like the consumerization of technology, as it were, and it's kind of the impact into businesses, but also into other spaces like B2B. That this whole thing's going to be pervasive, and the standards are going to go up for pretty much for everybody, right?
so I've always, for the last few years been doing the customer journey mapping, and then I've been doing the employee journey mapping. Your article made me realize I probably needed to start mapping the leader journey
Hmm.
in a way that I hadn't been doing before. And then ultimately, I try to overlay those maps to create an ecosystem map.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, you can't just win on the external customer journey and lose on the internal one. And right now, when people are working remote, a lot more people are working remote. You're going to have to figure out how to engage team members when you can't do it around accidental interactions at the water cooler.
Mm.
You're old enough to know what a water cooler is, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, I get that. But I mean, is that where you think the key challenge lies? Is kind of like doing that, because that's quite complex and sophisticated work, particularly pulling it all together and understanding how it all kind of like works,
Oh,
in
Adrian,
concert.
I adore you. You know that business is this incredibly complicated and fabulously exciting operation to try to sort out. And I do think it takes, this discipline
Mm.
to be successful. And people act like they can open up a shop and, no, there's a lot to it. And thank God for that, because it keeps people like you and I in business.
Yeah, I think that I've been rolling out this kind of little kind of piece of trivia that I learned as a pop quiz, um, and some people know it and some people don't. But I'm going to share it anyway because I'm guessing you might know it. But if you don't, then that'll be a surprise, but also a delight for me. Is Do you know if you typed in relentless.com into your browser, do you know where it would go?
I have no idea where it would go, though I am pretty quick. So I've put it in and I'll get your answer. Oh
It
my God.
Exactly. It goes to Amazon.
Wow. I'm sorry. That's cool. That's a very cool thing. Thank you.
You're welcome. And does that not tell you everything you need to know about Amazon?
Yeah, no, that is exactly it. And it does take the relentless pursuit of, and in their place, convenience and choice and
Hmm.
yeah. So effortlessness, all that stuff is part of the relentlessness of that brand.
But I think that's kind of thing. What I love about that is that because you're absolutely right. There's the this kind of greatness, or even just being on the edge of it, and requires kind of discipline and commitment and doing that hard work day in and day out. This is not many people that have, particularly in things like sport and stuff, they will tell you that kind of like the joy is at the end when you collect the medal or you win the race or you compete and do your best in things. But actually, the work is the discipline, the commitment, and the training, and the grit, and the grief, and all that sort of stuff is what is their day-to-day life.
The first book I ever wrote was on parenting, and I said there are 4 keys to parenting, and I think it's true for CX as well. First, you have to show up, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to show up, and then you have to pay attention. Just because you're there doesn't mean you're paying attention. And then you have to tell the truth. It's a lot easier. And then I said the last thing is you have to enjoy. You have to enjoy the journey more than the destination. And I referenced the fact that you have to realize it's not the fish that you're after when you go fishing.
Yeah.
And I think with the customer experience, it's not some outcome. It's the constant improvement of human lives, right? The lives of their people, the lives of the people you serve. This is such a noble and exciting journey. And it was made incredibly complicated for a period there throughout the pandemic. And I think it's going to continue to be as we sort through what it is that will make the world better than normal, better than it was before the pandemic.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Joseph, you know as well as I do, sometimes, all of this stuff can feel it's quite big, quite intimidating. And it's difficult to know where to start, as it were. And sometimes, was it like Confucius said, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. Yeah. So my question to you is that if people want to improve their service or experience to deliver to customers, particularly in this kind of changing world that we live in, what would be your best advice around the first step that they should take?
Enhance your listening skills, both at the listening for understanding and listening for feelings. And I mean that through your technologies, your surveys, but also just at a human to human level, listen well.
Awesome. Thank you. That's good advice. So one final thing, unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, I'm ready. I'm ready for the one final thing.
Perfect. So one final thing, as you've referenced a couple of times, I've published this book called Punk CX, and I've been doing a little bit what I call social research over the last kind of few months, last year or so, when I've been talking to people on the interviews, just to capture some different perspectives about what people think about punk and CX. And so my first question is, what 1 or 2 words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience?
So before I would have read your work, I would have talked about rebellion, because that was my concept of punk. But since, I think it really is tied to listening and delivering against what you understand. Perfect.
Listening and delivering against what you understand. Perfect. I love that. And then second question is, so what company or brand do you think epitomizes a more punk CX kind of ethos?
So I'm afraid you may not know it well in your part of the world, but Zappos, who I worked with here in the United States, which is an Amazon brand, by the way, the shoe subsidiary of them.
Tony Hsieh.
Yeah, Tony Hsieh.
I know them well, actually.
Yeah, he's very much a zigger when everybody else zags. So
yeah,
that's what I think of.
Perfect. Joseph, I couldn't have kind of picked a better brand because I know them really well. I know some people over there. I've been across and visited them, and I think I love what they do. And I love the fact that they were really super successful, and then Amazon bought them, and because they're so cool, they left them alone to almost learn from them in many ways.
I wrote a book about him called The Zappos Experience, and I interviewed Tony for Stronger Through Adversity. So he's in Stronger Through Adversity as well.
Nice, fantastic. So I would say to everybody that's listening, I would say grab a copy of Stronger Through Adversity. Sorry, my apologies. Stronger Through Adversity. It's a great book. It's a great piece of work. It's another one in the bookshelf from Joseph Michelli, which is, check out all these books, because I think you do great work, Joseph. I'm in awe of some of the stuff that you do. But I just want to say thank you for sharing your time and your insight with us today, and congratulations on the book. And that's been awesome.
Thank you. We can do this sometime without having to be on a podcast. So, we'll get on a Zoom meeting since we talked so much about
Let's do that.
that. Thank you.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. One final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.